welcome to SlatorPod, where we discuss the week's language industry news and other themes and topics in the localization and translation and language technology industry. So this week, I'm recording this from a different location. Not that our podcast listeners would notice or care, but I do, because it's beautiful outside. There's snow, and it's in a lovely place called Loc in Switzerland. So I'm enjoying a week up here in the mountains. And you are in, Esther?
I'm in London, as usual.
As usual. But you're heading over to
another day.
Ottawa. You're heading over to Ottawa soon, right?
So,
in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, in 2 weeks' time. So that will be another logistical challenge. So I'll be there for the ALIA conference, speaking there. But I will, of course, be taking over my microphone, webcam, etc., to try and set up over there and do another SlatorPod.
Great. And you can tell us a bit about what happened at the conference. Are we going to record this after your presentation or before?
No, because Canada's behind.
That's right. Okay, so it's going to be like your early morning, right? Before you give the presentation.
We'll work it out.
All right, we'll work it out. Great. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We have a very interesting article to talk about from a company we feature called BetterUp. Where we what we call a buyer feature or a user feature, where we talk about how they do localization. Then we'll talk about Honyaku's Q3 results, the big Japanese translation company. We talk about Straker acquisition, subtitling in Finland, and then a sponsored post around Indian language data that was sponsored by the Oxford University Press. And then you went to a meetup this week, so look forward to hearing from you about how that went. Cool. So let's jump into BetterUp. Can you tell us a bit more about that? And
Yeah, definitely. So BetterUp, we spoke to their localization program manager, a lady called Pętlicka, and who told us obviously about their localization operations. BetterUp is a mobile and app-based coaching platform, which is based in San Francisco. They have around 230 employees, and they've been running since 2013 when they were founded. Mm-hmm. They have enterprise customers, mainly about 100 or so, including Fortune 1000 companies. And localization plays a key role, Ella said, around competitive advantage and helping them reach their users and customers in different countries. They currently operate, I think, in 62 countries and in 30 different languages. So it's quite a wide-reaching operation. Mm-hmm. And localization is a competitive advantage, they say, in the one-to-one coaching market. Now, they've obviously got lots of different types of content, and some of those require slightly different workflows. So they have the app content, so strings that they send for localization on almost a daily basis, I think, and also a content library, which would include all of their resources for coaching, some homework assignments, and different kind of media as well. So they would have videos, some other kind of interactive content I think they're working on, podcasts and articles. But their content library is available currently in 6 languages, including English. Mm-hmm. So, and they've based the language selection on market research. So that goes into where are their customers and where are the main coaching hubs globally.
What are some of the languages, or the 6 core you mentioned, where the content?
Yeah, the 6 core are at the moment French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, and simplified Chinese.
Okay.
I believe, yes. And then within that, Ella in her role is also deciding which content is being prioritized for translation at what point. And is also thinking about what approach do they take to localization. And I think one of the interesting facts here is at what point they start to think about localization within the company. So this is not typically when, once all of the content has been drafted and once they're ready to push it out. But actually, she says the internal copywriters are really well versed with the localization and translation process, and they start thinking about how localization will work at the ideation stage when they're thinking about new content and new ideas. And one key workflow that Ella actually told us about and described in some detail is relating to psychological assessments. Mm-hmm. So this is something which is commonly used within the coaching industry to, psychometric testing and what have you, to assess different people, different coachees. And she described the process of Trans-Adaptation, which actually seems like a workflow that was developed independently by somebody called the International Test Commission. Mm-hmm. Which is not something I'd come across before in my localization experience. But I know that we were going to draw some parallels potentially between different areas of localization. Trans-adaptation is not one-to-one translation, but it needs to have, the target message needs to have the same impact in all of the different languages, because you want to get the same sort of equivalent answers out of people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I actually haven't come across trans-adaptation, even that term. I haven't come across that before. We have obviously transcreation. That's used to be a buzzword. I think right now it's another term for another kind of language service. And then we also have the translation of clinical validation, which is linguistic validation. Validation, which is a service in the life sciences where there's a similar, very stringent and very elaborate process around making sure that you get a certain language independency into the translation component, right? So it's not just you're looking for to take the language component out of the response you're getting to a certain input. So I think...
and a lot of that is also for questionnaires, isn't it? So
that's right.
Within linguistic validation, within obviously life sciences, you're asking patients or clinicians to describe their symptoms, describe how they're feeling. And obviously you don't want language to play a part in that. It needs to be consistent across the board so that you can compare responses and draw conclusions and analysis from the responses that are coming out from different countries.
That's right. So in that sense, the psychometric assessments are similar, obviously, to linguistic validation. It's very interesting that there's these elaborate workflows, and also that we haven't come across this. That's what keeps fascinating me about this industry, that you can be in for a decade or more, and then you come across a new concept, in a startup that's doing this. So, very interesting article, also well written by Marianne, and of course thanks to Ella for helping us with this. We do have a transcreation, multilingual content creation panel at SlatorCon London. That's not on the psychometric assessment or linguistic validation, but it's on the transcreation side. So it is a theme that I find fascinating and that we want to cover in more depth at Slator going forward. Another story we ran just this morning was about the Japanese translation provider, language service provider Honyaku. They gave their third quarter numbers. It's kind of a steady as you go company. They've been in the business for a long time. They're the market leader in Japan, and they're listed on the Japanese stock exchange. That's why they have to provide those results. And it's been going kind of sideways for them. I think the revenues were somewhat flat, down just 1% year over year. They did mention that their core translation business was suffering. They have some other business lines like conferencing services that are doing a little bit better, but the core translation services are down. They're still managed to generate nearly $80 million, like $78 million in revenue in those 9 months. So they're on track to hit the $100 million mark again.
Still over $1 million.
Yeah, $100 million. And then in terms of the profit, roughly $5 million. Since they're listed, we could look at how the shares reacted. So they actually went down quite a bit. It looks like some of their investors weren't too pleased with that. And they're incredibly, what in stock market lingo do you call a cheap company? They're very cheap. They're at, in terms of their total market capitalization, they're at 55 million currently. That's very cheap for a company that generates $100 million in revenues. So right now they're trading at half their revenue and roughly 10 times
it's
earnings.
Around the same price as Straker, I think, as well, isn't it? Sort of 44 million or something.
That's right, yes. But they have 5 times
way more revenue,
5 times revenues, right? And they have earnings as opposed to Straker that's basically at break even, slightly above break even at the moment. So the question would be, in many other markets, would be is somebody going to acquire this business, since it appears to be trading at somewhat of a discount? But with Japan, I think a lot of people might be cautious because it's a tricky market, and I'm not sure about the shareholder registry of Honyaku. Maybe there's some big investors and it's probably hard to make an acquisition. But generally at that price, it would be an acquisition target if it wasn't in a somewhat challenging geography to do business. I mean, Japan, there's a lot of LSPs, or some LSPs, some of the larger LSPs have big operations in Japan. But from personal experience, it's a market you have to be very, very committed to actually to do business in, right? You can't just have a rep office there.
Rock up.
Yeah, it takes a long time to understand this market. You mentioned Straker. They acquired another smallish, what we refer to as boutique LSP. At this time, very close to home. Straker is actually from New Zealand, and they acquired what appears to be New Zealand's oldest LSP called NZTC for just $1.1 million US dollars, which is relatively little as well, given that the business is doing $2-3 million US dollars. I would have to look this up, but it's probably around $3 million in revenue. And as usual for Straker, they're splitting the price the founders will receive into 2 portions. So first there's a cash payment, and then there's a considerable what they call earnout. That was that component we discussed with the Lionbridge lawsuit that was a few podcasts ago. So you need to hit certain targets. If you hit them, you're going to get another portion of the buyout. And so that's what they're doing here. So roughly 60% upfront, 40% in an earnout, to a total of roughly $1.1 million. So Straker continues this strategy of just buying relatively small companies and kind of aggregating them into a bigger unit, and then running it through their proprietary TMS. They call, what's the name of it? Ray. Yeah, they call it Ray. Okay, and Straker, we spoke about it briefly last time. They're into media localization, so I'm sure they're interested in that Finland story that we covered.
Oh yes,
subtitling in
nice
Finland.
Segue. Yeah, so we covered a piece. It was Seema who wrote this one about some new subtitling standards that have been published in Finland, relating to both Finnish and Swedish subtitling. Obviously, both the country has both languages in use there. And so I mean, the subtitles here, the standards are designed to promote consistency within subtitling in Finland. So it will focus on areas like quality, on terminology usage, but then also on some technical aspects such as line segmentation and all the other things that go into actually rendering subtitles. And it seems to have been quite widely accepted and endorsed within Finland. A number of LSPs were involved in the original working group and have already signed up to subscribe, to say that they're going to adhere to these standards. I think they mentioned that BTI Studios was one of the ones who'd signed up to the standards, although obviously BTI is now IUNO. And interestingly as well, I think at one point Netflix actually had a representative who was a part of the working group, although I think that person is no longer there. And Netflix have not yet signed up to say that they want to go by these particular recommendations for standards, although that may come later. And I think now's the time where the working group is trying to sign up people to say that they're going to use these recommendations.
But this is language dependent, right? I mean, obviously for Finland, it's likely to be, it's obviously going to be Finnish and Swedish, right? Yeah, they have a sizable Swedish-speaking minority in Finland. Would strike me as somewhat difficult for the vendors and also players like Netflix to adhere to this, because if you do a rollout in 50 or whatever 20, 30, 40 languages, and then here's our Finnish standards we need to adhere to, and then you said they were inspired by Norway,
Yeah, and I think also Denmark has something quite similar in place.
Yeah,
as well. So it seems to be gradually happening across some of those countries.
It must add to operational complexity, because then you can't have standards, or certain standards have to be very much tied to the language. So that's
I mean, I suppose if you're on the LSP side, or as a media localizer, potentially some of these companies are really only working into maybe a handful of languages around the kind of Nordic and Scandinavian countries. So, I mean, if they can reach a kind of consensus among themselves and on board some translators and, a number of other things, then I guess they could, in fact, influence best practice and potentially also advise clients or customers who on standards that they adhere to. But I see what you're saying, that, I mean, obviously, if companies and the large companies such as Netflix do have their own standards and certainly technical requirements as well. So may or may not decide that this is something that they want to also adhere to.
And they had an interesting note in there. Let me pull this up. Where they said, the working group also hopes that the recommendations will help subtitlers avoid negative influence from practices in other countries. And then they're saying especially the US. I think we wrote about, I think we need to dig a bit further into this, what they mean by this. What are the negative influences and practices from the US? That would be, if any listeners know what this is referring to, maybe add it in the comment section.
Get in touch.
Get in touch, add it in the comment section on YouTube.
I think Seema obviously did quite a bit of research into this, and Tess, who's our intern here in London, was also looking into some of the research around what came before these standards. Mm-hmm. But I mean, it would definitely be interesting to dig a bit deeper and see what's going on and what the end point is as well, what the end goal is for some of this.
I just wonder what the negative influence from the US could be in terms of subtitling. So when they're mentioning the specific that the US has a negative influence.
I know they were talking about Anglicisms creeping into Finnish language and things like, I mean, they were suggesting particular ways of dealing with things like cultural references, but also avoiding anglicized words. So I don't know whether they're talking about sort of linguistically, or whether it is more to do with sort of working practices.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, for languages, that are, I mean, even in German, there's a lot of Anglicisms coming into the country, and I think German is quite adaptable and doesn't care that much. I think, and it's also a somewhat larger language, so I think if you're Norwegian, Finnish, you're maybe a lot more protective. I remember that I spent some time in Norway in my early 20s, and they talked about the oil industry when they discovered oil in the late 60s, that they didn't have any expertise in oil and drilling, right? Oil exploration. So they needed these U.S. advisors coming over from United States. And they had a huge project, kind of government-funded project to localize the terminology into Norwegian, because otherwise they would have been swamped by just U.S. terminology and jargon. And so they translated everything.
Wow. It's quite an effort to do that.
Yeah, it was a big effort, but probably the alternative would have been that Norwegian would have been completely replaced by English, and there would have been, well, not in the country
maybe in a
per
specific
se,
sector,
but in that specific sector, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So they did that, and generally they're more. I mean, they even translate words like computer, for example. In German, we also call it computer. In Norwegian, they actually use a local term. So maybe that's one of the components where they. Maybe
some of the protectionist attitudes, which is actually something that the Mexicans were talking about when we covered the Mexican dubbing story. One of the argumentations over there was to do with, we want to preserve our local languages, which makes total sense, and promote them in the sense that they get recognition and establish themselves within the world of media as well.
True. Yeah. Terminology. Let's segue into Oxford University Press. That was a post written by Casper Grothwall from Oxford Languages.
Yeah, so it was a Q&A with Casper from Oxford Languages, exactly. So this is a division of Oxford University Press, which is specifically relating to languages, language data, curation. They also gather word lists and and make terminology lists and things like that for various uses and outputs. That this was a piece around Indian languages, and specifically how Indian languages are kind of performing online, and the language provision for Indian internet users. So, I mean, obviously, India, huge population, lots of potential internet users there, and also consumers. And OUP was doing a piece talking about how they're seeking to improve the experiences of internet users in India by helping to increase language provision in some of the local languages. I think Hindi obviously being a big one, Bengali, Telugu and Tamil, and a number of others. So they actually have, I think, 12 different datasets in 12 different languages available that you can access via an API. And this has been, the lists and all of the data has been curated by local translators in different hubs in India who've put together the data, which has all been curated and cleaned. And they hope obviously that will start to help provide a bit more availability of languages for the users in India. Yeah.
I mean, they have a huge, obviously, literally centuries old institutional expertise in doing this, and for English and other languages, the dictionaries.
Yeah.
And we did cover this like 2-3 years ago, that when there was a big push into Indian e-commerce, right? But there's a major lack of, translation capabilities, translation expertise, and also language data per se. So this initiative should help a lot, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the kind of low resource languages push.
That's right, yeah.
Which obviously has a lot of different applications, whether it's increasing online or improving online experiences, or whether it's, the big tech and AI companies using that for other purposes as well.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Anybody head over to the article. So then you went to a meetup. What was it this week? Was it Wednesday or?
It was Wednesday, yes. How did you guess? Maybe that's the standard day for meetups in the industry. Yeah, it's a language, going to get this right, London localization professionals. And we normally meet once a month in London. And this time also, I think I spoke about it maybe 3-4 weeks ago on the podcast as well. And this time we also had a presentation prior to our usual pub visit. So the presentation really is held under the banner of a localization surgery is what we call it. So sometimes presentations, sometimes discussions. This week it was a discussion which was led by Steve Moore from We Localize. So we actually went across to We Localize's offices just in central London. And the discussion was really around how to buy language services, which actually going into it, I was a bit like, okay, yeah, I don't particularly buy language services. But I mean, we had a room full of translators and people from small LSPs, from large LSPs, and buyers. Okay. And it was interesting that, everybody there is either selling or buying language services or doing both. Large LSPs are both sellers and buyers of language services. So we had, a discussion on a number of different levels. And we touched on topics like, when does it make sense for a buyer to do an RFP? Sort of shared some opinions and things around that. And then also had a bit of a divisive and heated conversation around the idea of test projects. Should you run them? How do they work? Who's responsible for paying who?
Test project.
Is it all just a farce? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on test projects? I mean, they're mostly for show, kind of, unless.
Well, okay, so this was my exact point, that if you're an LSP, you're going to throw the best translator on it and probably never use that person again because they're already at capacity. Yeah. However, the point was made that maybe these days you're not necessarily running, as a buyer, you're not necessarily running a project to test the translation quality. You might also be testing the workflow, push and pull between different systems, and everything like that.
Okay.
So there is some merit in doing inclusion. And then we had different thoughts around whether you should pay translators to do it or not. Maybe that depends on whether you're trying to onboard them onto the database or whether you have actual offer of work to pay to give to them.
Okay, I think maybe one free test to get them into the database. But I mean, if you're obviously doing client tests, then you probably should pay them more, not less, or not nothing.
But there's no, as far as I know, that I mean, obviously companies have their own, practices and standards around this, but there is not really one or any number of agreed industry practices.
I mean, in terms of the test, it's almost like if you're not able to nail a test, then obviously you shouldn't be considered at all. But it's not like if you nail the test, then you're going to be a great provider. But if you're not even able to nail a test, then what's the point, right? I think that's maybe also, the only point of a test.
If you can't nail it, then you really have no hope of delivering the service, I suppose. Yeah. And one of the buyers who was there actually made the point that the first step is even for companies to be willing to provide a test, because some people say no to test projects. In which case, so it's maybe not necessarily the fact of what the output you're going to get, so but even the willingness to be like
that. There's some natural selection at that point. Okay.
Yeah. There we go. But it's a bit of a minefield that we haven't quite solved that discussion quite yet. But that was the meetup, and then we headed around the corner to the pub for a while.
So what's going on with Loc Lunch? Did they do another one in London? You skipped it, or are you going there, or?
Oh, you're shaming me for not going. Yeah, no? That was actually the day after.
That was the day after.
That would have been, I think, yesterday. But I do have to do a bit of work. Yeah. At some point during the week. Loc Lunch, I plan to go back. We see some of the same people, but obviously it's a slightly different environment and different people come along as well. So I will try and get to Loc Lunch again soon.
Yeah, if it's just the day after, then I understand.
Yeah. Well, and also the Loc Lunch, the gentleman who runs Loc Lunch in London, Adam Grabowski, was at the Localization Professionals Meetup. There you go. There's a bit of kind of mixing.
Get it. Okay. Well, that was it for the week. Thanks so much for tuning in, and talk to you soon next week. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Bye, Florian.
Bye.